Our first paper is going to be the Oliver and Wood paper on populist and intuitions, and then we'll have John Kingzett to give discussant notes on that. So, Eric, if you would.
Once again, Herb and Tom, thank you for having me out. Thank you all for sticking around and coming on a cold day, and also staying through lunch. The research we're going to present on is part of our forthcoming book called Enchanted America that should be coming out next summer with the University of Chicago Press. It also builds on a project that Wendy, Ron, and I were working on separately from this on populism. Wendy and I started thinking about populism a few years ago, and then around 2016, kind of my other interest in conspiracy theories and my interest in populism converged, and you're going to see the consequence here. So the paper is motivated, and the research is motivated by, in a lot of ways, the improbable success of Donald Trump. He is somebody who violated seemingly every rule of campaign politics, particularly in the primaries. He was not seen as a likely source. And when we think about, well, why was Donald Trump able to have this improbable success, two of the immediate candidates that come to mind were his intense populism. So, for example, this is a quote from his last television commercial that he aired, arguing a very, very stridently populist, anti-establishment kind of viewpoint. And this was pervasive throughout the campaign in this kind of rhetoric. Donald Trump was also known and related to conspiracy theories. So he, of course, was an advocate of conspiracy theories prior to running the election. He was probably one of the biggest advocates of the Obama birther conspiracy theory. Throughout the election, he also advocated various kinds of conspiracy theories on a wide variety of subjects. And he continues to do so, interestingly, while in the White House and being at the sort of center of power. It still articulates a rather conspiratorial view of how politics works. And so how do we make sense of this? What is this? And I think what's to me is interesting is, why is it that this conspiratorial type of politics and this populist rhetoric, why does it gain so much attention? What is so appealing about it? We know that Trump is this populist and conspiracist, but why was this resonating with voters? And we want to set forth an explanation here and this comes from the book, and we think this type of populism and conspiracism represents a new kind of politics, or at least what we're recognizing as a new kind of politics. It's probably a very ancient kind of politics, called the politics of intuitions. And typically when we think about politics in the United States, we think about it as being organized on this sort of left-right continuum. But we can think of a different set of forces or a different dimension that organizes politics that up until recently I would say, is orthogonal to ideology. And this would be an ontological organization of politics. And on one side are people we call rationalists. And these are people who have kind of a post-enlightenment perspective on the world. They use logical deductions. They're appreciative of facts. They're dispassionate in their analysis. They have maybe overarching principles from which they deduce conclusions that sort of tie their opinions together. On the other end of the spectrum are people we would call intuitionists. And these are people who rely on their gut feelings. They're heavily swayed by symbols. They are oftentimes suspicious of expertise and authority. They are very, very passionate in their metaphors and in their understanding of politics. Now, these are stylized archetypes, obviously. Most people rely on a combination of both reason and intuition when coming to judgments. But one of the things that we find in the book is where you are on this scale can actually predict a lot about your beliefs about the world and your beliefs about politics in particular. The other thing I think that's interesting about this scale is that if you look at sort of the history of the conservative movement and you look at the history of ideology and the recent history of ideology in the United States, this seems like less of an orthogonal relationship to ideology, and it seems to be moving, that these two things are moving closer in line. That the conservative movement is becoming more of an intuitionist movement, and on the left you have people arguing, we believe in science as part of the liberal creed. And I think this is something that's relatively unusual. But what I want to explain here is that when we look at why populism and conspiracism are so appealing is because they tie into this idea of an intuitionist perspective on the world. Now, this begs the question, how do we actually understand how intuitionists comprehend the world? Rationalists, we could say, are relatively easy to explain because they're pretty explicit in their assumptions about how the world operates. Intuitions, on the other hand, arise from the murky depths of the gut. They're very, how do we know how our unconscious processes work? How can we come up with a way of sort of deciding what is it that organizes our intuitions and our understandings? And in the book, we actually look to magical beliefs as a guide to intuitions. There's a rich literature in psychology and anthropology on magical thinking, and we draw on this to come up with sort of a general theory about how intuitions work, and I'll just sort of briefly describe it here. On the one, we basically talk about two parts about how intuitions work, and this goes from Bronislaw Malinowski's work that magical thinking is emotional thinking. In particular, Malinowski argued that magical beliefs basically serve as emotional palliatives. When we encounter things that generate uncertainty for us, we embrace a magical belief in order to gain certainty and reduce our apprehension or anxiety. Secondly, building on this, we can say that magical thinkers, and hence intuitive thinkers, are expedient thinkers, that we're in a state of emotional disequilibria. We look for the explanation that will quickly or most expediently reduce that sense of emotional discomfort. And then thirdly, emotions inform our beliefs, that whatever affective state we are, we will adopt beliefs that rationalize that emotional state. Let me just explain this really quickly. So I'll give you an example. Someone encounters something that seems confusing and inexplicable, say, for example, the World Trade Center attack on September 9/11. We're put into a state of apprehension here. It's very hard to know exactly what's going on. Maybe there's some official accounts, maybe not. We basically glom onto a conspiracy theory about this, or some people may glom onto a conspiracy theory. For them, it's a way of sort of reducing their apprehension or reducing their anxiety and bringing them back to a sort of a homeostatic set point here. Of course, the difficulty, and what we can talk about this later with these types of belief systems, is that they don't really actually return us back to sort of emotional neutrality. They kind of keep us in this, emotional disequilibrium of, oh my God, there's a small secret group that bombed the World Trade Center, brought down the World Trade Center. Wow, that's just kind of a scary vision of the world. The other things that I want to say about intuitions is that they conflate internal feelings with external reality. And to me, a great example of this comes from my son when he was 5. He was up late at night. I was trying to put him to sleep. He was like, there's monsters in the closet, Dad. There are monsters in the closet. I was like, no. I opened the closet door. There are no monsters in the closet. Finally, after a long back and forth, he said to me, well, if there are no monsters in the closet, then why am I afraid? And I was like, okay, you got me there, pal. You win. But I think this is how our intuitions operate. We basically take our own internal feelings as indicative of what is happening in some sort of external reality, and then adjust our views to be in line with those internal feelings. The second thing that we would say about intuitions and magical beliefs, and this comes first from insights from James Frazier in The Golden Bough, which is he did this big compendium in the late 19th century about all the world's religions and magical belief systems, and basically identified two types of magic he said were common to all. What he called homeopathic magic, which is this sort of idea of things that are like each other have the similar qualities, and contagious magic, which was all religions have something where if you touch something taboo, you're impure, or if you touch something that's pure or sanctified, you can gain holy quality from it. Today, we would sort of characterize Frazier's understandings of intuitions as basically heuristics. And what he was talking about in terms of homeopathic magic, we would call a representativeness heuristic, i.e. we think that things that look like each other share their qualities. We also have a contagion heuristic. In our work, we also work at some other, heuristics that may be at work. The availability heuristic, in terms of we tend to prioritize information that comes sooner rather than later. Anthropomorphizing heuristic, I think this is very common in conspiracy theories, where we basically assume human-like or give human-like intentionality onto non-human actors. So anyway, this is our model of intuitions, that intuitions arise and are informed by emotional disequilibria, and secondly, that they draw on heuristics. And we're basically going to try to measure these with 3 sets of scales. We're trying to measure emotional disequilibria with a set of apprehension measures and pessimism measures. I'll describe this in a second. And the susceptibility to heuristics with a symbolic reasoning measure. The data we're going to talk about here come from a survey that was administered in late February and March of 2016 during the presidential primary. It was an internet sample weighted, administered through Qualtrics. The apprehension scale, we basically asked about 5 items here. And we asked things like, how often do you check the locks on your doors and windows? How often do you wash your hands with active antibacterial soap? Do you intentionally lock your doors when driving? Shred your bills before you throw them away? Lock your suitcases before you fly? You can sort of see the distributions here. We can put these together to make an apprehension scale. We have a pessimism scale, which we ask people to evaluate on a 0 to 100 scale, how likely it is that they think that there will be a recession in the coming year, a terrorist attack, an outbreak of a major infectious disease, or a war with China, Russia in the next 5 years. Sorry for the smallness of the font here, but you can see we have some mean scores here, but kind of a wide distribution on scores on these things, and we can aggregate those into a pessimism scale. And then symbolic reasoning we got from 6 questions, and I'll put 5 of them here, and we asked people to basically give us what their first choice would be. So we asked them, would you rather stab a photograph of your family with a sharp knife or stick your hand in a bowl of cockroaches? We asked them, would you rather yell, "I hope I die tomorrow" out loud 5 times, or ride in a speeding car without a seatbelt? Would you rather sleep in laundry pajamas once worn by Charles Manson, or pick a nickel on the ground, put a nickel in your mouth that you found on the ground? Would you rather grind your shoes into an unmarked grave, or stand in line for the 3 hours of the DMV? Would you rather spend the night in a luxurious house where a family was recently murdered, or spend the night in a dingy bus station? As you can see, what we're basically doing here, we're giving people pairs choices between something that has a tangible cost versus something that has a symbolic cost. And these symbolic costs reference the kinds of heuristics that we think occur a lot in our intuitive judgments. As you can see, we get kind of a distribution here. We also asked a question about buying lottery tickets, which I didn't talk about. I think that the interesting thing is people really don't want to sleep in Charles Manson's pajamas or grind their shoes in unmarked graves. And this one, to me, is the most surprising because, I can think a few things less appealing than standing in line to DMV. So anyway, this provides us a scale. We put it together with the apprehension and pessimism scale, and we create what we call an intuitionism scale. And it's we want to basically see how much people on the high end of the scale rely on their intuitions when making judgments. We think that these people are going to be high intuitionists and these people are going to be rationalists. And just to show you how this scale works, these are some predictions of supernatural beliefs relative to the intuitionism scale. So, for example, even if you don't get caught, you'll eventually pay for anything bad things you do. Do you believe in angels? Do you believe that God is an observant force? That things happen in your life for a reason? And really strong predictive power of this intuitionism scale on these supernatural batteries. We find this with fundamentalist beliefs, with paranormal beliefs, with anti-science beliefs as well. So, intuition scale is also highly predictive of populism and belief in conspiracy theories. I'm sorry for that. We measure populism, and we borrow from work that Wendy and I did in the paper that we published last year. And Wendy and I argued that we can measure populism in 3 dimensions, or it's important to understand populism in 3 dimensions. There's political populism, which is like questions like people like me don't have much say in what government does. There's cultural populism, which is more aversion to elites, not political elites, but cultural elites. So things like, I'd rather put my trust in the wisdom of ordinary people than the opinions of experts and intellectuals. And then there's a strong national identity. And in our March data, when we look at this, basically, if you look at the populism scale, if you look at all just the political populism, which is sort of, the parties aren't representing us, you can see that supporters of Sanders and supporters of Trump score roughly in the same kind of direction. The more establishment candidates, supporters of those don't really believe that. However, the other 2 dimensions of populism really are the factors that differentiate someone like a Trump or a Carson from someone like a Sanders. And that it's Trump in particular, his supporters scored highest in the kind of combination of all 3 elements of populism together. And they were really differentiated in this regard. We asked a series of 6 conspiracy theories. Everything from the Food and Drug Administration is deliberately withholding approval for natural cures for cancer because of secret pressure from the pharmaceutical industry, to the birther conspiracy, the truther conspiracy theory. And there's just time, I won't go through all those. We also find that in the primary election, Trump supporters were much more likely to score high if we aggregate all those agreement with those conspiracy theories into one scale. Far, far more likely to agree with conspiracy theories than other candidates. Carson supporters were just behind. You can see Cruz, Rubio, Kasich, Sanders, and Clinton lagging. In fact, Kasich supporters the least conspiratorial. If we do a multivariate equation where we're basically predicting support On the conspiracism scale, on the populism scale, we see once again intuitionism is a strong, strong predictor. In the same way that it was a strong predictor of supernatural beliefs, it's also a strong predictor of conspiracism and a strong predictor of populism. Moreover, the intuitionism scale also differentiates by candidate preference. So we see people who really like Trump had the highest, on average, intuitionism scores, followed by Ben Carson. The lowest scores, interestingly enough, came from Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. One of the things that's interesting about intuitionism is also it's very contingent upon ideology, and this goes back to this earlier point of how intuitionism and ideology are becoming aligned. When we ask people in terms of their self-designated ideology from very liberal to very conservative, and we look at their average intuitionism scores, and we generate a density plot to sort of give you an idea of sort of the distribution, we can sort of see liberals, are highly, highly varied in their intuitionism, but on average are score low on intuitionism. As you get up to very conservatives, also highly variant, but much, much higher on average on their intuitionism. And I think this speaks a lot to sort of the nature of what's going on in the Republican Party right now. If we basically look at people by virtue, I'm sorry, when I translated the PowerPoint, I kind of screwed these things up. These are liberals, these are moderates, and these are conservatives. Blues are Democrats, grays are independents, reds are Republicans, and the three bars within each group are the bottom third of intuitionism scale, the middle third, and the top third. We see an interesting idea about how ideology and intuitionism are becoming conflated, and then how this is represented itself in terms of partisanship. Amongst liberals are disproportionately on the low end of the intuitionism scale. They're also disproportionately Democrats. A mirror image occurs on the political right, where conservatives are disproportionately intuitionist in their orientation, and of course disproportionately conservative. And I think that's about my time, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Hello again. So obviously I'll be a discussant on this paper as well. I really enjoyed it. I think it's sort of a new, obviously a new measure that conceptualizes, sort of feeds into both populism and conspiracy theories, which is sort of just a fascinating sort of finding this sort of root way of thinking. So some of the questions I have are actually just how intuitionism might relate to other sort of theories of thinking. So something that sort of I was thinking about is, one, do you think that there's a higher level of difference between sort of people who, like within people or between people? So are there basically, so I'm thinking, are they either always thinking in these sort of magical terms, or do they sometimes think rationally, sometimes think in this manner, and is sort of the difference within people greater than or less than the difference between people? So this is a theory that, or sort of the data is on differences between people, but just sort of outside of the data that you present. And then sort of along those lines, how does intuitionism relate to thinking fast versus thinking slow? So system 1 versus system 2 thinking, sort of how does it feed into that? And then on sort of another note is on the sanctity moral foundation, or sort of that theory that this could be just tapping into a different moral foundation. Secondly, there's a great line in the paper that's populism, conspiracism, and intuitionism are dancers at a ball, distinct yet interconnected and always moving in sync, which I think is a beautiful way to conceptualize sort of how variables are presented to us. Just if you can clarify sort of how you think those variables relate to each other, and whether or not you think there's a clear causal pathway or sort of just different. I think that will be enough to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to remember, those are excellent points, I'll try to remember them. Going back to, we are trying to conceptualize intuitionism as these are tendencies, and so rather than even a single dimension, we wish there would probably be two dimensions. Imagine a dimension towards rationalism and a dimension towards intuitionism. The way I would say about it in terms of people are going to vary by virtue of their circumstances and contexts by how much they rely on things. So Malinowski had a great example of this where he was doing his ethnographic work on the Trobriand Islanders, and he noticed that the Trobriand Islanders basically used no magic when they were fishing in shallow lagoons and ponds, but when they went out into the deep ocean, they had lots and lots of superstitions, and it had to do with the degree of uncertainty that they were facing, and I think the magnitude of the consequences of that uncertainty. So I think that's when, and if you think about when we're facing uncertainty, when we're by definition not knowing, we're lacking information by which to make judgments, we have to refer to our own kind of innate inferences. And that's what we think we're trying to capture with these intuitionism scales. It differs from moral foundations, and then Tom and I have a paper on critical of the moral foundation scale because most of what I think Haidt characterizes as the kind of purity, authority, purity, authority, sanctity scale. What's what?
Loyalty.
Loyalty, thank you. Those effects go away once you control for fundamentalism. And so fundamentalist beliefs are actually kind of, I think what he's measuring are fundamentalist beliefs in the guise of moral foundations. What I would say about how this works is that there's this interesting interrelationship here. People who are in fundamentalist belief systems, we would argue, get caught, and what fundamentalist belief systems do, or conspiracy narratives, is reinforce an intuitionist way of understanding the world. So, I mean, intuitionists have a real great advantage in terms of beliefs that tap into our intuitions, because that's what we're born with, and that's sort of a natural way of understanding the world. Rationalism is the weird thing that we have to sort of train people towards. And there are belief systems that operate that we would suggest reinforce this intuitionist perspective. And religions, and particularly fundamentalist religions, really draw heavily upon this. But there are other types of belief systems out there that do the same thing as well. And so when we think about sort of differences within individuals, well, we don't have this here, but if you look at sort of the types of people, other types of people who are likely to be, intuitionists, people who are raised in conservative households, people who are in conservative religious traditions, people who attend church quite a bit, these are oftentimes predictors of leaning more towards the intuitionist side of the scale. You had another question?
I think the last one was just how it relates to fast and thinking.
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is definitely inspired by Kahneman's work, and what we would basically say is most of the time when we're in system one type of thinking, we're not really doing much political processing of information. And what Kahneman's great insight was is that as we move from system one to system two, and I think this stands in stark contrast with George Marcus's work, which suggests that, oh, I'm moving into system two because I'm apprehensive, and I'm going to become a more deliberate, rational, contemplative thinker. And Kahneman would suggest, no, you're trying to make your apprehension go away, and you're trying to do it in the quickest way possible. And so you survey amongst the menu of options, and if you don't have any available options, you're going to be probably more likely to rely on your intuitions, or you're picking up those options that reinforce that intuitionist way of viewing the world. And so, Kahneman's favorite quote is that system two is lazy. And what he's basically meaning is that it's actually heavily reliant upon heuristics. And we would also amend sort of, and this builds on work of Milt Lodge, for example, on information, emotional cues as well. And so this is our model is hopefully is an elaboration of that.
Can we actually come up with cool questions after the second presentation?
Okay, sure.
We'll just do them all at once. And actually, our second presenter today is Kelly Garrett, and he'll be followed by discussant Laura Moses.
All right, thank you all for sticking around. I'm actually delighted to be a part of this workshop and also to be a part of this particular pair of presentations because I think we're very much concerned with similar things. In fact, I have other pieces that have to do with conspiracy ideation and intuition that I look forward to talking more about. But today, what I'd like to present is some work looking at the relationship between people's use of email and social media and how it might have influenced their acceptance of falsehoods during the 2016. And actually, I'm going to end up referring back to some 2012 data because this is an issue that I've been thinking about for quite some time, and I think the evidence are germane to both, to the current situation. So at this point in time, it seems a little funny to start with this question. Why does it matter? If you've been paying attention to the news, if you've been watching what's happening on Capitol Hill, you're probably aware that there are a whole bunch of people who are pretty concerned about the role that social media might have played in the election. At the same time, if you're going on that intuition, the sort of conventional wisdom, then you might also think there's no point in asking this question as a research question because we know the answer. It's been clear since November 9th that Facebook is responsible for Trump's victory. Every news article has told us that. All right, so setting aside the conventional wisdom, let's take it apart and ask, well, why might we care about this as a scholarly community? What are some of the factors that make this important? And some of these are pretty obvious. The rise of social media as a prominent form of political information gathering. But also, it's easy to forget about email. Email remains one of the most important ways that people communicate online today. And so we don't want to take that for granted, especially given some prior evidence that I'll allude to in a minute. On the technology side, if you haven't seen data like this, during the 2016 election, this data is from August 2016, a representative GFK panel. We've got 684 online news users, and among that group, 23% said that Facebook was their most important source of news about the presidential election. That's more than double the number who named CNN, who named Fox. And Breitbart, in case you're wondering, is here. All right, so Facebook, important. And the other reason we might say this is important is that there were certainly a range of kinds of falsehoods that were out there. There were the falsehoods that were made about candidates. The fact that Obama was responsible for sending U.S. dollars to Chinese companies for building bridges during the Money Recovery Act. Or then we have our president who has already been pointed out, shared a variety of theories about the world that aren't specifically about a target candidate, but have to do with important campaign issues. He made a variety of statements, and I'll talk about those. All right, another reason that these technologies are really important is not just the fact that they're out there, but the fact that they capitalize on some unique attributes of human relationship. When we talk about email and social media, we generally talk about people communicating with people they know, people with whom they have an existing relationship, a relationship that is likely important to them in some fashion. Even if it's a crazy uncle, it's still someone you may feel some hesitance to respond to. You might be more likely to ignore. You might be slightly more likely to take seriously. So relationships matter. Also, we have good evidence from the current election that strategic disinformation was a part of the strategy, and social media was an important conduit for that strategic disinformation. Moving back to the prior election, the evidence is more anecdotal, but there are some signs that email, whispering campaigns conducted over email, were an important part, even in the 2008 election, a way of getting ideas about candidates that no one was publicly endorsing, but that were circulating widely along this sort of hidden terrain of email communication among partisans. The other reason that I think this question is important to follow up on is that we have some tantalizing evidence from the past. The 2008 election, I have cross-sectional data suggesting that people who used political email more often were more likely to endorse a variety of falsehoods about the candidates. Actually, about Obama, let's be honest here. And in 2016, Alcott and Getskow have done some work based on some experimental work and some data on how prevalent the exposure to social media and the falsehoods that were a part of the Russian disinformation campaign were, and made some estimates about what kind of effect we might expect. And their answer is, well, there probably was one, but it's probably small. All right, so that sets the stage. A couple other things that are worth mentioning, this is going to be pretty obvious to this audience. Political biases are a factor here, so we know that people are going to be more receptive to attitude-rooted falsehoods. And as a result, I'm going to do some work looking at whether these media effects differ. And in 2012, I'm going to do it in terms of party affiliation. But in 2016, I'm actually going to shift to candidate favorability for, again, some of the things we've been talking about today. Trump was an unusual Republican candidate. His relationship to the Republican Party was not typical. And so that's what I'll be using. For the 2012 data, this is going to give me the opportunity to focus on rumors and falsehoods about the candidates. In 2016, I'm going to shift my attention. So the prediction is that email and social media will both reduce the accuracy in people's beliefs about the candidates, and that this relationship will be moderated by their party affiliation. But there's a really important open question of whether social media will have, and email will have a different effect on campaign issues than on candidate issues, or candidate beliefs. A couple things that are going on here. One is that citizens, voters, may make decisions, may make judgments differently when they're evaluating an individual than when they're evaluating an issue. We know that people have very strong visceral responses to candidates. And if those visceral responses are more pronounced when you're thinking about, is it my guy or the opponent, versus when you're thinking about, is it my issue versus an opposing issue, then you might anticipate slightly different dynamics. The other reason that we might expect differences between what's happening in between candidate beliefs and beliefs about the issues has to do with the way that the technologies are deployed. We have evidence that social media and email were deployed to spread falsehoods about candidates. We have less evidence that they were being used to systematically spread falsehoods about issues, with the example of Trump a moment ago notwithstanding. So it's an open question. I want to see whether these factors work the same. The data that I'm going to use come from two panel studies. One conducted in 2012, the second in 2016. They were both 3 waves. The first wave came right after the conventions, the second mid-September, and the third right after the election, starting in November. Each wave lasted a couple weeks. They each started with around 1,000 people in the first wave, roughly 80% attrition at each wave, so that when we were done, we were ending up with 650-ish respondents. And this is through GFK's knowledge panel, like some of the other panel work that you've heard about today. So we can say that representative-ish. A couple things about the measures, just so you know where I'm coming from. When we're talking about beliefs about the candidates, there were 4 falsehoods about each of the candidates, Romney and Obama, plus a true statement about each one. And the questions first, the survey presented a false statement asking, have you ever heard this before? Ever heard anything suggesting that it's not true? And then a statement questioning what the individual believed to be true. And for all of these analyses, it's coded such that the accurate values are coded high. And if anyone said that they'd not heard of it before, and not heard anything suggesting that it was not true, they're simply omitted. I didn't want to capture people who were giving me an instinct. I've never heard this before, but now that you ask me, I'm sure he's guilty of that. We're throwing those people out. In 2016, there are 4 campaign issues. Whether immigrants are more likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans, whether climate change is real, whether repealing the ACA would reduce the deficit or increase the deficit, and whether the vast majority of Muslims support violence against the West. These are average to produce again, a score where higher values mean more accurate. Social media and email use, these are self-reports. There's a problem with that, of course, but because these are panel data, I'm comparing individuals to themselves. So even if we have some bias in how people are self-reporting, at least we can say, well, when this person self-reports higher use between waves, these are the effects we see. We had 3 items in the 2012 and 2 items in 2016 having to do with political email receipts, and 5 in 2012 and 6 in 2016 having to do with getting political information via social media. And this included a variety of things, including reading things in people's feeds, clicking through and reading stories, reading opinion pieces, watching videos, attending to memes, and so forth. Also, because I wanted to look at this question of whether Facebook was somehow unique, there's certainly a lot of concern about exactly what Facebook did compared to other social media. There was a long list of sites that people might have used. You actually saw the list of sites in that opening slide, allowing people to indicate which of them they'd used in the past month, so I could actually distinguish between social media users who who included Facebook among their sources in those two. As I've already begun to allude, this is using a fixed effects model. So each individual is effectively a control for him or herself. That hopefully does a lot to get rid of the concerns about, well, whether it's some other factor that you didn't include. As a consequence, the models are very simple, right? The models, we just have our core predictors because all stable features are effectively controlled for. I'm interested to hear whether there are thoughts about if there need to be other dynamic factors that are accounting for. Right now, we have email use, social media use, and Wave to see whether people's beliefs in these claims are changing over the course of the election. And then there are two stages. The first model just has those. The second adds the interaction with party affiliation in the first case, candidate favorability, and Facebook use in the second. So without further ado, jumping to the reactions. We see when we're predicting accuracy about the false statements made about Obama that circulated during the 2012 election, that unlike what I saw with the cross-sectional data based on the 2008 election, email had no significant effect. This could be a product of the fact that this is a more robust, a more rigorous test of the claim. It could be a change in how email was used. But there's nothing, this is about as close to a zero effect as you could expect to get with a fairly large data set. Social media use, however, does have a significant negative influence. Now, note these are 90% confidence intervals here, so this was a directional prediction. The expectation was that social media would make things worse. The data are consistent with that, and when we add the interactions, we see that, in fact, the influence of social media, well, the visual's a little easier to understand. The influence of social media for independents, the hollow circles, was, in fact, positive. The more often an independent got their media, their news via social media, the more accurate they were relative to Republicans. As their use of social media increased, their accuracy about Obama decreased. Not a particularly surprising pattern. Also, there were, again, no effects having to do with Romney whatsoever. This parallels what I saw in 2008 when there were no effects. Obama's the only candidate who ever seems to be affected by the false claims. Turning to the 2016, now we're dealing with the campaign issue beliefs instead of the candidate issue beliefs, and we see a very different pattern. In fact, the only direct effect, unmoderated, is the effect of email, and in fact, email was associated with a more accurate assessment on those four beliefs that I talked about before. Adding the interactions, email does not significantly interact, and on the social media side, the only thing that we see, and again, the interaction will be easier to understand visually, is that compared to non-Facebook users, Facebook users were saw a significantly more positive effect of their use of social media on their ability to answer questions about political campaign falsehoods over the course of the 2016 election. All right. So to take all of this and give you a very pithy summary, I would say that yes, we have evidence that social media and email can influence people's beliefs. We see it in the form of candidate beliefs in 2012 and in terms of the issues, well, in 2016, but these effects are really very small. I think that the hand-wringing that we're seeing right now about how Facebook could somehow single-handedly have turned the election, or that Russian disinformation is profoundly important to what happened in this election, I think that's stretching it. I don't think we can make that claim right now. Furthermore, I think it's important to be cognizant of the fact that these effects are dependent on a whole bunch of other stuff, right? We see candidate beliefs mattering, candidate support mattering in terms of what you believe when you talk about candidate beliefs. We see email and social media differing. We see social media in general and social media that includes Facebook differing. We see it varies whether we're talking about candidate beliefs or issue beliefs. So these are important revisions. Now, the one thing I don't want to signal is that we shouldn't be worried about this, right? The fact that there wasn't a large effect of either of these types of online communication to me, signals on the one hand, maybe we can have a little sigh of relief. Okay, that's probably not what determined this election. In fact, I think the things that we've been talking about here this morning are likely to be much more powerful ways of making sense of what we saw. But at the same time, anyone who's paying attention to politics is going to be very clearly, keenly aware that there's potential here. We see hints of this kind of technology having an influence on what people believe. We see, and furthermore, we see that it can certainly create chaos. It can create a lot of public uproar about the democratic process, about the way that citizens engage in the political process, and the way that these big technology companies are operating. And so any political actor who wants to think about trying to be strategically deceptive, who wants to use disinformation strategically in the future, is going to have to take very seriously their use of online media. And one can only assume that they're going to get better at it as time goes by. So with that, I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Professor Garrett. This gives me a great opportunity to reflect for a moment on two topics I like best, technology and politics. Your paper does a really great job, I think, of helping us organize the way we think about all of these things that vary with information communication technologies, whether it's Facebook or Reddit or CNN Online or email. There's a lot of different interactions and different modalities happening. So this paper does a really good job of framing it to how we think about it moving forward. I wanted to take a minute to sort of needle at this idea of email and social media. In my mind, I could think, sure, they affect how people shape their beliefs, but in really, really different ways in my mind. Social media is much more passive in a way. The role of identity and presence are much more salient in an online social media world where the user has a lot of control over what they choose to share and how they choose to share it, but a lot less control over what they're seeing because it's based on who their network is. Whereas email is kind of more active. To receive a lot of political email, you either have to opt into it or you have to have fairly active political circles where they're actively engaging you in a debate or trying to impose a belief upon you. I was hoping you could kind of share your thoughts about how we parse out these differences in thinking about communication as a whole as we move forward in other research that looks at these kinds of influences on beliefs. The other thing I wanted to sort of touch on is thinking about what citizens share online versus self-reported behavior in participating in these online political activities. Looking at a meme is pretty different than commenting and actively engaging in debate on social media. So how do we think about that? And what ways can we think about measuring that in the future? Obviously, this is really difficult to get at, and so self-reporting is a great way to start with that, and with in-person effects help control for a lot of that variation. And then the last thing is thinking a little bit about who the non-Facebook users are. When I looked at this difference initially, my knee-jerk reaction is, who isn't on Facebook? So, and the stories I think about in the users are, people who are opting out because they don't see it as a value or as socially important, or people who are on the other side of the digital divide. And so how do we think about people with limited access to ICT, technology, and internet? How are these things shaping or not shaping their beliefs? So, and I'll open it up.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those comments. A few observations. So I agree that there are some very important differences between social media and email, and in the interest of time, I certainly flew through I glossed over some important differences. I'm going to think a little bit about whether I agree with precisely the differences as you articulated them. So The suggestion that social media is somehow less managed than email, it's an important question, but one which I think is in some ways still an open question. We have seen in the last few years an increasing number of people willing to prune their social networks based on the political commentary that they've experienced. And we're actually using the same panel data to try and tease out exactly how prevalent that was. So depending on what we see there, I may or may not agree with you. My hunch is that, in fact, social media is being pruned in a pretty active way, either through unfriending or through muting or through even the passive, the relatively passive choices that people make to like some and not others, or click through on some and not on others. We know that Facebook is attending to all of these actions, and every action you take comes to inform the stuff that you're shown in the future. And so when even though your feed may be not, you don't think of it as being actively managed, the fact that you're engaging with some stuff more than other stuff leads to a kind of management without you necessarily realizing it. And in some ways, I think email, you could make a similar sort of counter argument for email, saying, well, email ends up, we may be less able to control our email feeds if we're talking about family and friends who talk politics. Because while you can certainly unsubscribe to a news feed or a politician's feed, it may be socially uncomfortable to respond to a family member saying, I really wish you'd stop sending those political emails. You're a little crazy, right? All right, the question of whether identity is more salient in social media, this is a very interesting idea, and there's certainly a role of self-presentation that happens online. And in fact, this gets at one of the things that I thought, well, maybe social media will be more accurate. Maybe social media will have less harmful consequences than email, because we know that work in deception has shown that when people are posting information in public fora, they are more likely to be honest in their self-disclosures than when they are sharing information in a form that isn't going to be seen by others. This was specifically done in the case of people's resumes. They would lie on their resumes if they thought only their potential employer would see it, but they would be honest about them if they were posting it to a board where past employers would see what they claimed to have done. You might expect something similar happening in social media. You might expect people to be more conscious of the reputational effects of sharing something that's not true on social media versus email. Because email, if you share something that's not true, well, the only people who are going to see it are the people you shared it with, and these are probably people you feel pretty secure in your relationship. Social media, it can expand more broadly. And this may be why we see, when Facebook looked at its own behavioral data, they find that when something has been Snoped, that is, when someone comes along, looks up a false claim on Snopes, posts the link to that Snopes article, the reshares drop dramatically in the immediate aftermath of that. People don't want to be seen as endorsing falsehoods because they don't want to look like a fool. So in some ways, you could expect that social media would be different for precisely this sort of impression management function that you're talking about. On the measurement side, I so agree with you. I wish we had something better than behavioral measures. And so this work was funded by NSF, and God bless them. I couldn't have done it without them. I have only minor resentment of the fact that a few years ago I had arranged an agreement with Facebook to actually collect behavioral data and do intercept surveys of people based on their behavioral data. And the NSF reviewers said, gosh, we know everything there is to know about how people's beliefs about false rumors are formed in the online environment, so we're not really sure why you want to do this. So I agree it's important, but I'm not even sure if I got the money today that I'd be able to, because Facebook has clamped down, because this is really bad press. For the most part, they don't want to be talking about how they might have shifted the election. Even if the news is, hey, you're making people more knowledgeable, and the people who are more knowledgeable were more likely to vote for Clinton. They don't want that headline either, right? They don't want to take a side. Not that they have a choice. Finally, you raised the question of who are the Facebook non-users. To first a clarifying response. What you were seeing up there were social media users who used Facebook versus social media users who didn't use Facebook. So you had in there the people who used Reddit but didn't use Facebook, the people who used Twitter or Google Plus and didn't use Facebook. And yeah, I mean, these aren't unusual among social media users. Facebook is the behemoth. And many people who opt not to are conscientious objectors, like, Facebook, they invade my privacy, they're all about marketing dollars, etc. But it's still an interesting pattern. It's an important pattern, I think, that people who are using Facebook aren't worse. And so, then the question of this digital divide, people who aren't on social media at all, I mean, thanks to the press, I'd say that social media was a powerful force. I mean, Twitter, which is used by a tiny fraction of the population, what, 15%-ish? Everyone knows what President Trump tweets, right? And you probably didn't see it on Twitter first. You probably saw it on a headline, on whatever your preferred news source is, in the email that you got from a friend. You know, like, everyone is talking about these tweets without ever using the medium itself. All right. I think that is your questions.
And Kelly, if you want to have a seat, and Eric, if you can join us, we can just open this up to the floor. Yeah, sure.
So, one question for each of you. Doug, I like the fixed effect strategy, but I was just a little uncertain, like, if there's only email and social media use in the model, there's no other measure of any other media source. There's no newspapers, there's no nothing. Like, how do we know that anything about social media or email is the actual driver as opposed to the actual original news sources themselves, which are the source of most of what's being shared on social media in the first place, as you suggested with the story about Twitter. Eric, I guess I would be interested to know a little bit more about what would happen if this intuitionism measure was sort of unpacked into its constituent components of 3 different scales, and sort of how they work differently or similarly in this context. In particular, I'm a little nervous about a handful of the items, given that they were asked sort of at the peak of the primary campaign. You know, you're asking people, do they check the locks on their doors and windows after Donald Trump's been scaremongering about a crime wave for 6 months? And you ask people about whether there be a terrorist attack in the United States after Donald Trump has been scaremongering on terrorism for about 6 months. And so I'm a little afraid that some of those kinds of questions are endogenous, whereas the third scale, the crazy scale, right, like the bowl of cockroaches scale, he wasn't scaremongering about cockroaches. So that really seems to me to be like, by itself, something that's pretty interesting and not clearly connected to, not potentially endogenous to sort of the campaign discourse. Look, what happens when you sort of pull apart those 3 individual components? Do they work differently? I mean, they scale together, but like, are they related to support for the candidates in different ways?
You want to go first?
Sure. It's an excellent point, and with retrospect, obviously that's a simple thing to add, because I have the measures. In part, the choice reflects the fact that this has been modeled in a lot of different ways to try and make sure that this is robust across different approaches. So I have looked at it with random effects models, in which case I do include all of these controls, and I have looked at it with SEM to look for possible mediation, and the pattern looks the same in every instance. So would have been better had I had the controls in there, but I think I have reason for, based on other analyses that you haven't seen, to believe that these effects are robust.
So we started collecting data on these scales in 2014, so well before. So in the book there are 7 surveys that started in the summer of 2014. The symbolic reasoning scale, what we call the symbolic reasoning scale, and the apprehension scales, some of those items came from Jack Citrin, and he calls them the Noia scales. They're like the paranoia scales. Those are actually pretty consistent over time. The scale that actually we're worried about as far as the component scale is the pessimism scale. And the pessimism scale was working very consistent across samples until we did a post-election survey in December. And suddenly, a lot of our intuitionists became a lot less pessimistic, and a lot of our rationalists became a lot more pessimistic. And so that's like, oh God, okay. So that's the scale that I'm, as far as like the component of this. And we are hoping that as we go forward on this, we're going to come up with better scale measures. I think intuitionism I have confidence that we're tapping into something. Whether or not our scale measures are the most precise indicators or instruments at this point, I'm hoping we can do better, so trying to work on sort of what intuitionism 2.0 might look like. And then, but individually, you know, when you combobulate the intuitionism scale, the items work differently. The big lifters, though, are apprehension and pessimism typically on the political items. And the symbolic reasoning is better when it comes to, it's pretty good when it comes to conspiracy theories, and it's better when it comes to like supernatural beliefs and paranormal beliefs and these types of things. It becomes a little noisier when we start talking about particular types of political items. But so that's, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Second.
looking at the rationalism part, instead of the other one, are liberals becoming more rational? Can we conclude from what, or can you conclude from your data that conservatives might become much more of the intuitional types, but are liberals becoming more rational, or is because it seemed to me that what you went through the scale and then you went to the one that is crossed like that would seem to indicate that.
So we've only been asking this back to 2014, so our conceptualization using our scales are going to be limited. There are some pieces of data that are available that would suggest that. So when you look at, for example, general social survey data, and just looking at measures of the ideological distribution relative to fundamentalist beliefs, in the 70s, there's really a very, very weak correlation between ideology and fundamentalist beliefs. And after 1980, that gets much, much stronger, and that's continued to get stronger ever since. So that indicates at least that, not only are conservatives more likely to be identifying themselves as fundamentalists, but liberals are much less likely to be identifying on these religiosity items. Similarly, when you look at, if you look at surveys from the late 1950s and early 1960s, almost the entire country believed in God. And there was also a lot of endorsement of science and kind of competence in science. And it's interesting that you've seen this polarization about at least 20% of the country now doesn't profess belief in God. But also confidence in science has also diminished. And that's become, I think, more polarized along an ideological continuum as well.
Dan?
Yeah, question for Kelly, just to make sure I'm interpreting what I saw there correctly. You're asking people how frequently they do these things, email or Facebook and so forth.
How frequently they received political information via email.
Okay,
or vice
political information in particular. Okay, so what you're looking at is change over time in that, influencing change over time in belief in inaccurate things.
Right.
Correct? Okay. So I assume you just kind of have as a working assumption that there's an equal amount of misinformation in both of those streams, roughly, of social media and email, if you're comparing the predictive power of the coefficients.
So I actually wouldn't say that it's safe to assume that the information streams are comparable in terms.
Okay. Do you think there's more misinformation in one or the other?
I wish I had a good answer to that. I don't think that we have. I mean, we have very high profile information on the kinds of false claims that were being shared on social media. Email is, there is no good way that I am aware of to tap exactly how much misinformation is
But does
flowing.
it go both ways? I guess what I'm thinking of is that, the coefficient reflects how much misinformation goes up when that use of that thing goes up, and vice versa when it goes down.
Yeah.
Does it work in both directions when you look at increasers and decreasers over time? And then secondly, it's with information, obviously you can get your misinformation corrected online too.
Yes.
If you go to the right place. So to what extent are people, corrected and then correct, stay that way, versus, if they start out correct, do they become incorrect as a result of an increase in the use of the medium?
Right, so I haven't looked at that, and it's an excellent question. That's starting with that last point first. It's an excellent question. Perhaps tangentially related to that, in the 2016 data, I also I distinguish between what people know about the empirical evidence and what they say they believe themselves. So there are a series of, in the political knowledge battery, there are a set of items that have to do with each of these. Do you know what experts have concluded? Do you know what the evidence on this issue is? And intriguingly, we see that neither email nor social media make any difference on that front. So people's familiarity with journalistic conclusions, with scientific evidence, is not altered. It's only what they endorse as the belief that changes as a product of this use. Like I said, that's a tangential response to the question.
Yeah, no, well, it might be interesting to compare because many forms of political knowledge, like once you learn who the president is or who who's on the Supreme Court, you know that. It's unlikely you're going to encounter information out there that gives you a different answer
Right.
later on. So it should work in one direction, but not the other.
Right.
But I wonder how that then applies to the case of disinformation. Is it as likely to increase or decrease misinformation?
John?
Yeah, for Kelly as well. I'm not a student of campaigning, but I gather the literature generally suggests that it mostly doesn't make much difference one way or the other. Are you suggesting there should be a change if it is piled even higher and deeper?
If there's not a response, if the falsehoods accumulate more rapidly,
Well, all campaigning is falsehood practically. I mean, they lie about their record, they lie about their opponent's record. I mean, straight up, or they don't lie, they basically are selective, whatever.
I think that there's
So
a
no one trusts them basically for good reason, because they're obviously self-interested.
I think there's a qualitative difference between saying something and then shortly thereafter saying, I didn't say that, or making claims that anyone who has looked at the evidence would say are false, and what has been more traditional kinds of claims making. I think there is a difference between strategic disinformation, trying to create ambiguity around whether there is even a truth out there, and trying to argue over does trickle-down economics work? Okay, you're going to see some debate around the nature of the facts on that issue.
And a lot of debate.
Yes, absolutely. But I think that there are some important differences, and I think that as the instinct to use more extreme, to be more willing to simply say, well, I don't care what the fact checkers, the experts, the journalists, I don't care what anyone says. This is my truth. I think that does risk creating a problem because, and this kind of ties into what you were talking about, in my work on intuition.
But the problem's already there.
Yes. In my work on intuition, one of the things that we see is that there's actually an important difference between those who say that truth is itself political, those who rely on intuition, and those who say they need evidence. Those are three different dimensions that are all part of what we often talk about when we talk about intuitiveness. You know, the intuitive person you might think is someone who doesn't need evidence and who has this sense that truth is very relative. But in the data that we collected, we see that these are three largely independent and very low correlations between them, and that they do different things. And the people who say that truth is political, by the way, that's weakly correlated with conservatism, like 0.2. These individuals are more likely to embrace falsehoods about political issues. They're also more likely to embrace conspiracy theories. That is the sort of thing that worries me more, this sort of shift towards there's just no way to know the truth because everything is political.
So increasing the falsehood quota will cause people to believe more in falsehoods?
I
did in the past.
I fear that increasing the noise in the environment makes people more willing to throw up their hands and say, well, you know, there are too many
That'd be
conflicting
very rational.
All right, we have Rick and then a question in the back.
Question for Eric, too. You could say a little more about why you think, what's causing this inflation of intuitionism and conservatism, or republicanism? What's under that? Because it seems that the degree of conservatism is allied with Republicans, and Republicans traditionally allied with higher income, complaints that it's millionaires that are running the country. It's not usually the low educated and non-rational who become millionaires and billionaires in this country. And my intuitive sense on campus here, as you move to the School of Engineering compared to, say, the Division of Arts and Humanities, the number of Republicans go way up, especially if you get to engineering. And, I studied the Middle East more than America, but there, the number of Muslim fundamentalists who are physical and mathematical scientists is very high. That's where the core of that support is. So I'm wondering if it's really anti-science, or if it's anti-social science, or sort of kind of science. Because I'm not sure that these are people who are just rejecting all science, or maybe they are, but I just would be interested in what you think's going on here.
Sure. I don't mean to suggest that there are not intuitionists on the left, or the right is now all non-rationalist. There's still plenty of rational conservatives. My wife is as liberal as they come, is a strong intuitionist. And, but I think if you go, why is the right trending more this way? And I think if you look at the history of modern conservatism, say dating back to William F. Buckley, whereas when, Buckley starts the National Review, there is an idea of embracing moral traditionalism, embracing the role of the church, but it's also kind of keeping the intuitionists a little bit at arm's length. And then you have, following Goldwater with Phyllis Schlafly and kind of the new right emerging, a much more enthusiastic embrace of an intuitionist type of politics. So in the book, in the last chapter of our book, we look at this and kind of trace the history of this kind of competing tensions within conservatism. And I think with the rise of the moral majority and the embrace and alignment of a lot of Christian fundamentalists with the Republican Party and the conservative movement, that tension became even more pronounced, and those tendencies became more pronounced. And arguably, whether or not this is going to be a lasting trend or not, but the rational conservatives right now they're in the wilderness. There are still plenty of intuitionist liberals kind of all over the place, but the dominant discourse within the conservative movement right now is a very strongly intuitionist one, at least we would argue. And why that's happening relative to socioeconomic status, like you would think your kind of country club, Chamber of Commerce Republican is going to be a very rationalist kind of person. Probably so, but they are probably less influential in the conservative movement right now and in the Republican Party than they were at one time, or at least blatantly so, maybe behind the scenes still.
And using OSU students as an example, the OSU campus Republicans didn't endorse Trump. But Buckeyes for Trump is a very different group to OSU campus Republicans. They're almost unrelated. To the extent that you find young Republicans who are engineers, I'll grant that the engineering faculty here are probably more Republican than the arts and sciences. Those are some very reluctant Trump voters.
We have one in the back.
Yes, the first presentation this morning and the first one after lunch both began with the word populace. Now, populace could mean a lot of different things, and I'm wondering if they mean the same thing in these two presentations, and if somebody from each could comment on that. So the first one is populace and the representation gap, and then it's populace intuition in this afternoon's one. Is it even the same subject, or is it something different? I'm not familiar with the scaling system.
Sure. I hope it's the same, because Wendy and I co-wrote the paper defining it. I don't think we've drifted that far apart yet. So.
This morning was a lot more historical, and went to elections from 1892, 1968, 1996, etc. And this one was, about the most recent primary.
So Wendy, if you want to speak up to this too, but in the paper that we wrote, we basically characterize populism as a style of political rhetoric that's animated by a centralizing notion that some set of elites have absconded with the rightful sovereignty of the people and have, depriving the people of what is their due in terms of their natural right to order the world. And so the whole question is, who are the elites and who are the people? And that gets defined in various ways. When we were doing on our research, we identified, we fielded a couple of surveys that had lots and lots of questions trying to get at these various dimensions, and we identified these three dimensions, at least in the United States, that seem to be really important. This kind of political populism, which is, the political parties are equally corrupt. The problem is with the parties in the system. A second dimension, which is the problem is with elites, particularly scientists, experts, economic elites. And then the third dimension would be this strong nationalist identity. And what we showed in the paper that we presented, which I did a figure here, is if you look at different supporters of different candidates, it's in the Carson and the Trump supporters score really high on all three of those dimensions. And that stays, I think, in contrast to like Sanders supporters, who score very high in political populism, but very, very low actually in both what we call sort of a cultural populism or nationalism. And I think that's what makes them socialists. I don't know if we could go back in time and look at those three dimensions. You would have a better sense of this, Winnie, than I would historically.
Well, but I do think there is a real connection to intuitionism and populism. I mean, if you go back and you read the populists of the late 19th century, they had all kinds of conspiracy theories about who was at fault for producing these circumstances. Or if you go back and you read Father Coughlin or Huey Long and the kinds of tales they would spin about, this nefarious, it was Roosevelt for Coughlin, right? So I think there is this, and if you think about, Eric's idea that under conditions of uncertainty, people have to find some meaning for, to make themselves feel better. And so in all these populist episodes, there usually also happen at times when at least certain parts of the population are suffering economically. And they're looking for a diagnosis of why, and why isn't it getting better, and which makes elites a very favorite kind of bad guy, right? Because they want to blame it on somebody, and the populace provides them with both the diagnosis and the remedy in often very simple language, which again would appeal to intuitionists, I think.
I think your question really helped to answer Rick's question, which is, I think at the descriptive level are different. One is about belief contents and the other is about belief style. And I think the interesting question is, why are content and style converging? And I think the answer is the second dimension of politics has gotten stronger. And if the tendency to engage in magical thinking and therefore preference for intuitionism is driven by sensitivity to uncertainty, which is strongly related to the second dimension of politics, then that's your answer. And I guess in that regard, I would ask, have you looked at how variables like the need for closure would relate to your measures, and are you purporting to measure something akin to closure sensitivity, uncertainty aversion, or is it something qualitative to do?
Yeah, we in one of our 2014 surveys, we fielded a battery of personality measures trying to get a sense of, okay, what are some of the personality correlates of this? And we didn't find that so much. The Big Five, when I did this, all it made me do was become very skeptical of the Big Five. Big Five doesn't encapsulate that at all. What we did find was not need for closure, but need for cognition. John Cassiopo's measure correlates strongly with this, as well as some discussed sensitivity scales. So our intuitionists score higher on it. Whether or not that's separate or not is another matter. So what we do know about our intuitionists, they're more likely to have been raised in conservative households, not necessarily politically conservative, but strict households. They score higher on the authoritarian child rearing battery. So in terms of that is sort of a tolerance for ambiguity, or so we can see that as also occurring. Income negatively correlates with intuitionism, although that basically disappears once you take into account financial anxiety. And so the differences in income level, the fact that lower income people have higher intuitionism is largely because they're just more financially stressed. And once we take into account their financial anxiety, that goes away.
Herb, you had next.
Yeah, there's some studies which I don't necessarily fully believe in terms of relating heredity issues, genetic differences to conservatism versus liberal differences. Would you expect the same in terms of spiritism and intuitivism? Or not really? Would you see this as more in the environment, things that are learned from your comments very early?
I will put it this way, I don't know enough about genetics to be able to posit like where that mechanism would lie. I mean, maybe, but like, why is my wife and I, who share very much in common, why is she so much more intuitionist than I am? maybe it's her nature more. But without some sort of more specific kind of causal mechanism, I'm really wary of trying to go down the genetic path.
Maybe you suggested Carly would have pretty hefty genetic.
Would suggest that, but once, I think, and this goes to this debate we can have in the discipline is, if we're going to invoke sort of genetic sources, I think we should probably have a better model of linking those sources to some kind of behavioral or attitudinal outcomes than we probably do right now.
We're requesting grant money to kidnap twins and raise them apart. It's important enough, you have to get an answer.
We had to know twins raised part of them. Exactly.
Yeah.
So what struck me about both these papers and this topic is I wondered to what extent it would benefit from really long-term historical perspective. I'm not an expert on it, but my sense is that on the question of rationality versus intuitionism, there have been these cycles of American history on at least something like this dimension. So if I'm remembering this right, the Constitution is written in an era of sort of maybe hyper-rationalism and deism in American sort of intellectual history. It had been preceded by a wave of evangelical thinking within American Protestantism, prior to the end of the 18th century, but then after, in the early 19th century, we got another rise in evangelicalism, and maybe that subsides. And so I just wonder whether or not we're seeing something in America today that fits into that long-term up and down a degree of evangelical type thinking compared to rationalist type thinking. And then similarly on the issue of campaign falsehoods, email versus social media, I'm very agnostic in my own thinking about what role technology plays versus other elements within political culture. And again, can we somehow tease that over time? And we've had lying in political campaigns going all the way back. And again, the degree to which they become salient depends on how close the election is and how relevant those lies may be. And I'm trying to go off of memory, but my sense is that 1844, for example, was a hugely consequential presidential election between Polk and Clay, very close, in which there was lots of lies circulating. So no email, no social media, but it'd be interesting to think about, was the electorate very rational or evangelical in that moment? What roles do lies play in sort of politics? And as obviously as hugely important as the Russian disinformation campaign was this year, it feels to me, I could be wrong about this, but the sort of most consequential lie in recent American political history was the Swift boat phenomenon, which created its own verb. And that, we had email, we had a little bit of social media in 2004, I don't know, but the mechanism of distribution and the mechanism of belief, I don't think was particularly tied to Facebook or necessarily email. It was a different phenomenon. So I think this is very rich grounds for discourse, but I'd encourage sort of an extension of the conversation both historically and some of these other lines of argument.
Just to add kind of a historical, populism often emerges after there has been some kind of technological revolution that makes it easier to transmit information. And so in the 1890s, you had the telegraph, you had railroads. In the early 1950s, you had television. That's really how Estes Kefauver, got to be in the national consciousness. And then this year, we had kind of the social media revolution. So there is, I think, a technological story that's also part of these episodes, not just this kind of evangelical versus rational thing, but I think there is a technological component as well.
Well, perhaps that's because new technologies allow entrepreneurs to do end runs around parties.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's how Estes Kefauver could, beat Truman in the New Hampshire primary.
Well, you also have to wonder how that might be related to these great awakenings, or these moments of evangelical revivalism, or so the proliferation of new religious sects, in the same way that new technologies might be allowing new sets of ideas or transgressive ideas to kind of dominant religious orthodoxies to be transmitted in the exact same way. So that these things are cycling together, the exogenous variable may be some kind of technology.
I would say that in the social movement literature, there is reasonable there's a fair amount of evidence that these technologies of disruption that's what is mattering here, is that you are changing the dynamics, you're changing the opportunities that the individuals have, because not all the players have figured it out at the same time. And so innovative strategies that didn't exist before are suddenly being deployed, and everyone is scrambling to figure out how to respond to them. So in some ways, this is less a story, I think, about the innate capabilities of the technologies. Not that those are trivial, they are important. But what is most important, I think, is that they create moments for people for stakeholders to gain an advantage that they didn't have before, because it is new, because others don't know how to respond yet. And so when one player figures out how to turn something to their advantage, so the whisper campaigns over email playing under the radar might have been to the advantage of one party over the other, because the other party was still trying to figure out how to do something about it. In 2012, the Obama campaign was very strategic about, very proactive about trying to fight online misinformation. And so in 2016, is this is somehow social media, are we seeing that, unfortunately I didn't collect data about what was happening on the candidate side in the 2016 election, and so it would be fascinating to know, did we see a stronger effect in 2016 than in 2012? But I don't have the data to answer it. But it does speak to the fact that, in my mind, 2016, around the issues, social media weren't being leveraged to try and advance the kinds of false claims that they were being used to advance in 2012, right? You see a different pattern between the two elections.
We had a question back.
My question was kind of covered. So.
Oh, okay.
I'm wondering if you could, Eric, to expand on a point made by a previous questioner, which is to say maybe that when we're talking about trust in science, is it possible to isolate or separate out trust in social science versus trust in the natural sciences, right? Because it seems like a lot of the sort of intuitionists are actually sort of, casting skeptical glances upon social scientific claims related to policy change, right? To say, sort of take global warming, right? I can believe in the weather as an actually existing phenomenon, but I don't believe in the sort of, pointy-headed social scientists who say, in order to fix it, we need to, do A, B, and C.
Oh, but they're not believing in the pointy-headed climatologists.
Yeah, but there's like a way in which those are like blending together. They still probably think, wouldn't be surprised if they still believe like in the periodic table.
I see what you're saying, but I think their skepticism of the natural sciences are anything even more severe, largely because a lot of natural scientists evoke very counterintuitive claims about ideas. So lots of the natural sciences, the reason why the natural sciences are where they are now is it took so long, just resisting so much of what happens in the natural world is counterintuitive. Right. And so think about like germ theory, for example, the efficacy of vaccines. These are very, very counterintuitive notions. And we see this in our data, like people who are high on the intuitionism scale, they really like herbal remedies and natural medicine. They're very skeptical about vaccines. They think gluten is bad for you. Yeah.
But, yeah, have you ever tried to actually ask them what they think of, say, forecasting model of the next election? Or,
And on that, they're really great.
But it's rational to be suspicious of that.
I agree, yeah, exactly. That's interesting, yeah.
If I could add, I actually disagree, because let's look at how many times science has gotten it wrong.
Sure.
And first, butter's bad for you, now butter's great for you.
Right.
And then, there have been a lot of changes in what is accepted knowledge. And I think for that reason, people have some skepticism, whether or not, they go too far is another issue. But given that their own motivations sometimes fit better with the answer that isn't supported by science, it's not surprising to me that they think, oh, well, that'll be proved wrong in 3 years, just you wait.
Yeah, if the driving force is some sort of economic interest, and you're reaching for some justification to support your position, yeah, because causality comes reversed. Yeah.
Sorry, we actually have one.
I have a very disorganized thought for your question for Eric. Do you think that the increased mapping of situations into conservative, right, Republican Party orientation has the potential to produce a status quo bias in policymaking? In that we were talking earlier about sort of symbolic policy preferences for Trump, where Trump says liberal commentators say, well, if you actually wanted to do that, the policy making, here's how you go about building a wall, and here's how much it's going to cost. And, you know, John Q. Trump voter, like, it would be impossible to build a wall. And the Trump voter said, don't care, he's going to build a wall.
So to that extent, Trump's photos of the wall are really the Trump policy initiative. Like, I'm going to take a photo of 4 types of wall, and the wall will be 50 feet long.
Right.
But the photo will exist, and that will, and that will like mollify some intuitionist preference that I'm being protected.
Well, that's not quite where I was going with that. Where I was going with that. Well, no, like so when Reagan's running against H.W. Bush, and Reagan's going to do big tax cuts, and Bush said that's voodoo economics, it's not going to work, and that had some purchase in the Republican primary, sort of. And now, you know, Mitt Romney in 2012 says, I have this $5 trillion tax plan. Obama says, well, that you flunked the arithmetic, and Romney says, no, I don't care. And now you see when Republicans actually run up against a policymaking challenge, like repealing the Affordable Care Act and replacing it with something terrific, they have to make the numbers work.
Yeah. Well, we have an example of that in the book, which is on the ACA. So we asked people in one of our surveys about the 5 major provisions of the ACA and whether or not they were accepting of them or wanted to get rid of them. And then you take people who want to reject 2 or more, and you say those are anti-ACA type numbers. Those numbers are pretty small. And in fact, our intuitionists are actually more in favor of the ACA than non-intuitionists. Later in the same survey, we asked them how they feel about Obamacare. It goes the opposite direction. Our intuitionists hate Obamacare. And, you know, but it goes to your point, and I think that's, and this is what Dan was talking about, it's about if you traffic in metaphor and symbol as your orientation towards the world, then you will be satisfied with metaphorical or symbolic gestures. I think this is partly what fuels Trump's preoccupation with these things. And he wants these symbols because that's really who he's speaking to and what he is about in a large way. You know, to put it another way, this is, I think it's, you know, in secular academia we lose sight of this fact, but, you know, about 1/3 of the country believes that we're living in end times, as foretold by biblical prophecy. And if you do hold that belief, your orientation toward reality, you know, you're looking for signs and symbols kind of all the time. But no, but that's a very symbolically oriented kind of approach towards, as a symbolically oriented epistemology. And I think this is what intuitionism is. And so I think you're right insofar as they will probably be much more drawn to kind of symbolic gestures and probably a lot noisier when it comes to tangible types of policy. It probably would be more status quo oriented as a result.
We have time for one more question. Tom?
Yeah, there's one of the dimensions that correlates with ideology in terms of a sort of an explanatory style is a stress on dispositional causation as opposed to environmental or situational causation. And who is it that's telling us that situations are politics? It's left-wing social science, right?
Yeah.
So I just wonder if that's something that's emerged in.
You know, that's great. I don't think we have any items that test directly into that, but that's actually fantastic. That's a really great point.
Cool. In that case, we'll end on a really great point. We have a 15-minute coffee break before our last panel. I'd like to thank our presenters once again. Thank you.